All right, so moving on to the final segment. Should Tony Ferguson retire from the UFC? So this is, I think this is really a no-brainer, and I say that with all due respect. But I do believe that it is best for Tony Ferguson to retire from the UFC. Dana White even said it after the UFC 296 UFC 296 main card that it is best for Tony Ferguson to step away from the MMA and to retire from the UFC. Tony Ferguson is on one of the saddest declines in UFC history. You look back from 2011 to 2019, Tony Ferguson was on fire and hot as a forest fire, one of the hottest MMA fighters in the sport. He was very special. He went 15-1 from 2011 to 2019 and had a total of 11 finishes throughout those years in the UFC. Now looking back from 2020 to all the way up to 2023, he's now gone 0-7 and he's on a 7-fight losing streak, losing his last 7 fights. And he's just getting worse and worse every time he gets back into the octagon, and I say that with all due respect, but he's not as violent, he's not as aggressive, and he doesn't close the distance anymore in fights. I think Tony Ferguson, is best for him to retire from the UFC, and I think his career is over as we know it. But he got cooked against Paddy Pimblett at UFC 296 on that main card. He just did not have a good performance, even though the fight was a total of 3 rounds. I do believe that he got shut out by Paddy Pimblett, as I get tongue-tied, in those 3 rounds at UFC 296. So he didn't have a good performance. I'm not sure if when Tony Ferguson's UFC contract ends. I don't have the notes in front of me for that, and I don't know that off the top of my head when that man's contract officially expires. But I do not see it for a while. I do feel like that Dana White is just going to put Tony Ferguson on the shelf. Whether his contract expires in 2024, 25, I think Dana White is going to do everything he can just to have Tony Ferguson finish out his contract, but he's going to put him on the shelf. And I don't think we're going to see him on any UFC main card. I'll be very shocked if we see him on some prelims moving forward, maybe to build up a young fighter and for a young fighter to get their feet wet against a big name like Tony Ferguson. And I'm very surprised that Tony Ferguson has actually said on social media that he does not plan to retire from the UFC anytime soon. But to me, it's just in his best interest. Like I just said, the stats don't lie and his decline does not lie, that we've seen him in his past 7 fights, and his prime years are way behind him. It's in the rearview mirror at this point. So there's no need for Tony Ferguson, whenever his UFC contract expires, to go into another MMA promotion like the PFL or any other MMA promotion, because his prime years are over. There's nothing really left for Tony Ferguson to do, in my opinion, in the sport of MMA. He's done everything he could, and his prime years are behind him, so I do believe it's best for Tony Ferguson to retire from the UFC. But that is all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for listening. This is your host, Tom Cyree, signing off, and I'll see you guys on next week's episode.